Hello, I'm Rabbi Mark Gelman.
And I'm Father Tom Hartman. We're the God Squad.
Welcome back to our Muslim Neighbors program, where we try and broaden our spiritual horizons. Tom, one of the things that's true of every living culture, whether it's religious or not, is that every living, vibrant culture produces two kinds of literature: law and legend. Stories and laws of how you have to live. Whether it's American traditions, we have American laws, we have American stories about Pecos Bill and about Paul Bunyan and myths and legends and stories, and religious.
And Rabbi Mark Gelman.
And absolutely. Well, that
To be written.
The God Squad is part of the American story. But in religion, they have the same thing. In Judaism, for example, we have something called halakha, which is our law. It means a path, the way you go, the way you walk. Mm-hmm. In Taoism, the Tao is the path, the way you walk. Yeah. And in Judaism, we have stories, and they are called Haggadah. That's what you tell, the stories you tell about God and our tradition.
And in Christianity, we have the Beatitudes as an example, the teachings of Jesus, the parables.
Stories, right? And your law is canon law.
Right.
For Catholics. Now, in Islam, they also have, as every living great culture has, two traditions. But in Arabic, the first tradition, the tradition of law, is called Sharia, but it means the same as halakha. It means the same thing, how you walk. How you walk through the day, the rituals you do, the obligations you have. And the other for Islam is called hadith, which are the legends and stories of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and about the traditions and the stories of the founders of Islam. So today's show is about law. Today's show is about Sharia. And joining us on the show, we have some wonderful, wonderful guests to join our friend Faroque Khan.
Joining us is Mohammad Fadel, who is the president of the National Association of Muslim Lawyers. He holds a doctorate in Islamic law and has published extensively on this topic. And of course, as Mark mentioned before, our good friend, Dr. Faroque Khan, president of the Islamic Center of Long Island. Welcome, Farouk. Welcome, Mohammed.
Thank you very much.
Oh, good to have you with us. What is Sharia?
Well, in a general sense, Sharia is just the path to God, right? And so it just covers, everything that a human being should know and do to live in a way that is pleasing to God.
Is this something that is written?
Well, there are lots of writings about the Sharia, right? But in principle, as a theological matter, the Sharia is essentially sort of part of God's eternal will, right? So the Sharia itself is an eternal part of God's revelation, but scholars write about it and expound upon it, right? But that in and of itself is not the Sharia.
So it's not like the Bible, where for years it was passed on orally and then it was codified in words. It's different than that.
No, yes.
It's a concept.
Yeah. And if I could just make one small correction, Rabbi. Hadith, Muslims wouldn't describe as stories or legend.
What would they say?
Hadiths are reports of the Prophet, as you mentioned.
Right.
And
stories, though.
Yeah, and we take that as evidence of the Sharia. However, we do have a whole body of stories and myth and legend as well.
And what are they called?
They're called just qisas, stories, narrations.
So hadith would only be stories about the Prophet.
Yeah, and of course we make distinction among hadiths that are considered to be sound. In other words, there's a good chance that they are true.
Right.
And then there are other hadiths that we consider to be unlikely to be true, and some that we consider to be completely forged. Nevertheless,
really?
Muslim scholars spent a great deal of time and effort classifying everything that anybody had ever said about the Prophet and attempted to sift out what was considered to be reliable material from what was considered to be spurious and indeed forged. Mm-hmm. So, but all of that goes under studies of the Sharia, because Muslims believe that something that the Prophet said is evidence of God's will.
Right.
As opposed to, for example, I'll give you an example. If you look at classical works of Quranic exegesis, like For example, a very famous scholar from 9th century Baghdad named Tabari, who wrote an encyclopedia, he called it the Encyclopedia of the Quran, essentially. Lots of the commentary he brings in includes many, I would say, stories, part of the oral Israelite tradition, right? Especially concerning Old Testament figures.
But here's
right?
the point that I think is common and is important for people to understand, and if it's wrong, please correct me. And that is that all of us share in the New Testament, in the Quran, and in the Hebrew Bible, a formative text that has both laws and legends combined together in the same text.
Right. I would agree with that, just as long as you put in bracket, what the word legends mean, because like for most Muslims, anything that's in Revelation, they consider to be true, so they wouldn't.
Oh
call it
yes,
legends.
same with Jews.
I'm still a little bit curious as to what the Sharia is.
Yeah. Sharia is the divine law which we follow. It's composed of the religious component. How do I pray? How do I give my zakat? How do I perform the Hajj? Those are rituals which are codified and they're not changeable. The rest is the worldly affairs. Somebody kills somebody. Somebody wants to get married. Somebody wants to civil law, criminal law. And so there are two separate components, the worldly affairs and the religious affairs. And the religious affairs, we get guidance from the Quran. We get guidance from the teachings of the Prophet, the Sunnah and the Hadith. And then if we don't know something, we get together and develop some guidelines, ijtihad. And finally, if you can't get an answer from these three ways, you come to a qiyas, basically. You make your analogy, your best guess, and come up with an answer to a situation, which we are facing day in and day out now with the modern technology and issues of ethics and so on. So it's basically a roadmap of how one conducts one's life, both religious as well as worldly.
So this is a very important point then that's also common to all our traditions. From this formative text, we all have authoritative interpreters. What are they called? What's the name? We call them poskim, and in your case, the interpreters of church law are?
The bishops, the Pope, the cardinals, they are the magisterium, they're the teachers of the church.
Yes. And who are the interpreters of the Sharia?
In Islam, they're called mujtahid. Mujtahid is somebody who...
Mujtahid.
Mujtahid. M-U-J-T-A-H-I-D.
Okay.
Or imam. But imam sort of with a capital I, not somebody you just see as a prayer
right.
leader.
We have the same
We
thing.
not only have difficulty with imams, we have difficulty with time. So we'll continue our discussion on Sharia and see how it is practically applied when we return on our Muslim neighbors. So please stay with us.
Welcome back. We're continuing our discussion of Sharia, Islamic. It's much more than Islamic law. I was wrong about that. And talking about it, this umbrella over all Islamic sacred teachings, which is Sharia, is our friend Dr. Faroque Khan of the Islamic Center of Westbury and attorney Mohammad Fadel, who are helping us to learn about this.
You know, Mark, one of the things that you just said is so important. We bring these programs to you so that we can learn more about each other and help each other to grow. And when you walk in somebody else's territory, sometimes you will make mistakes. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. It's okay. We're here as brothers and sisters in God.
That's right. And quite often Tom makes mistakes, and we tolerate them, and we live with them.
Oh, how good of you. Now,
So-
what was that talk you gave the other day on humility?
Humility, right.
That was the shortest talk I ever heard you give.
Ever. So I now understand that Sharia encompasses Hadith. It isn't separate from Hadith. It isn't separate from the legends. It's everything that determines how Muslims behave, how they walk, what they do. Is there, as in the consequence of the Reformation, where there's Protestant Christianity and Catholic Christianity, or in a little bit of a different way, in Judaism we have European Judaism, Ashkenazic Judaism, and we have Oriental Judaism, as it used to be called, Judaism of the Mediterranean and of Israel and of North Africa, which is Sephardic Judaism. And you have, of course, what we all are aware of is the Sunni-Shia difference. Is there a difference in the Sharia for Sunni and for Shia?
Well, if we limit Sharia to Islamic law, sort of in the sense of
Which I
rules-
just was supposed to
Right.
not do.
Right, I agree with you. But when we start talking about now sectarian differences, it only makes sense if we're going to look at things like ritual law and ritual observance.
Right.
Yes. Now, in terms of ritual observance, Muslims have a great deal of variety. Some of that goes back to theological differences in the case of Sunnis and Shia. But even within Sunnis, there's a great deal of variety in ritual observance. But those aren't considered to be issues, material issues of
Could you
difference.
give us an example that our viewers might understand of such a difference?
Well, it's
Not abstract or
right,
obscure, but
right. It requires some sort of familiarity with the way Muslims, for example, pray and worship.
okay, but just something.
You know, like for example, the adhan, which Muslims say before prayer, right?
An introductory prayer.
Well, you know, you've heard of mu'adhin. If you go to a Muslim country, 5
Yeah.
times a day, they say
The
Allahu
Muslim
Akbar.
who calls from the
Right. The way
minaret.
that is said
Uh-huh.
varies
Oh.
from different places in small ways. In small ways, based on the different schools of law that are followed in the Islamic world.
Well, let's take a case that we all are aware of, Terry Schiavo, for example, the question of how to treat someone who can't express their desires and who is on a feeding tube. Would there be a difference in Sharia about how to treat her?
Actually, we grappled with this issue just a month ago through the Islamic Medical Association and came out with a position paper on end-of-life issues.
What did you decide?
Well, we made some recommendations. This is a very, very complex issue with differences of opinion. First of all, Terry Schiavo, from the Islamic perspective, was alive.
Same from our perspective.
She-
And our perspective.
We're all gonna
her
agree.
As
cortex
opposed
was-
to the Pope who is dying.
Yes.
Right.
So Terry Schiavo deserved all the care which a living person deserves. The question becomes, should we be putting in tubes and so
Right.
on to give, and there was a difference of opinion on that.
Right.
But from a Islamic point of view, she was as alive as all of us
Any of
are.
us.
Any
Now,
of us
now
are.
let's say you have a Sunni mosque, and let's say that the imam in the mosque in the masjid says this is the way. This is in. Would that ruling apply to Shia?
I go through this all the time in my capacity as a physician. I get called to families where the loved one is in an end stage of life, is in a critical condition, and we can just make a recommendation.
I understand.
And finally, the decision comes down to the family,
Yes,
whether
of
they
course.
accept it, they don't accept it. It's not mandatory, it's not binding.
But in general, a scholar who is respected in that field would have authority over both.
Well, this brings us to how do we interpret and apply Sharia. The first is what's in the Quran. The second is what did the Prophet say or do about
I
it.
understand.
The third is Terry Schiavo case, for example, where a group
The
of us
practical instance.
practical, where we group of us got together. Our intentions were to come up with a rational answer, and we came to some conclusions. Were we right? We hope so.
Mohammed, is there a worldwide respected authority? Like in the Jewish community, there once was Maimonides had authority over all the Jewish community in the world. He was so respected. And in the Catholic Church, of course, the Pope can speak with authority for Catholic law. Is there anyone in Islam who has that kind of authority?
Not really. And the reason this goes back to the way sort of Muslims think about their moral obligations toward God. Muslim theologians divided people's obligations to God into two categories. those that were known by necessity. In other words, a layperson could pick up Revelation, just on a lay understanding of Revelation, and know these are things that God absolutely wants me to do.
Don't murder
Right,
people.
okay. Then there's a whole area of life, most of human life, which is gray, uncertain, unclear. In that area, Muslims are required to practice what's called ijtihad, practical reason. They think about this new circumstance based on what they know from God, right? And they come up with a solution. In that area of life, right, differences of opinion are tolerated and accepted, and so everybody is considered to be, acting morally, regardless of how they come out on these gray areas.
That is one
right?
of the things that we're working on more and more with people, where in many of the documents that the church comes out with, the document is really, the way I was trained, the beginning of the discussion rather than the end of the discussion. And how do you get somebody to take ownership of the issue? Frequently, in issues say how a family would get along, or such as the feeding tube experience with Jerry Scheibo. So many people go from having no experience in matters like this and just reading the newspaper. We're asking people, how can you go a little bit further and understand some of the theological questions? Now, Sharia itself, though, what countries follow it and do most follow it?
Okay. Well, again, now I'm going to have to, again, when we talking about a country following Sharia, what we mean now is in what sense do certain countries practice Islamic law in their courts, for example. Most Muslim countries, in one respect or another, will apply Islamic law in certain areas of social life, particularly family law. There are only a few countries that apply Islamic law sort of comprehensively to sort of all areas of sort of the legal system.
This has been in the news, a complex and controversial area, the Sharia law for families of husbands' relationships with wives, and some cases have been publicized where there was a kind of almost ownership in a certain way of a woman, or treatment of wives that didn't seem to conform to other people's sensibility about it, but it was, according to the reports, Sharia law, that say a husband who suspects his wife of adultery or something like that. Is there a conflict between Sharia law and the laws that we would know in America, in, for example, like, say, marital relations or family?
Well, I mean, as a historical matter, Islamic law as it exists, in books, was mainly developed in the Middle Ages. So it's sort of a
Same as our law, right?
So it's a very trivial exercise to go to medieval law books and pull out rules that moderns would find to be, contrary to their sensibilities, right? That doesn't mean that as a matter of principle, Islamic law tolerates spousal abuse, for example. Matter of fact, I would point out as a lawyer, in many ways, Islamic law was much more protective of female rights until the last 50 years. For example, prior to the last 50 years, a woman could not sue her husband. If a husband beat her, there was something called interspousal immunity. Spouses couldn't sue each other. In Islamic law, that never existed. So if a husband abused his wife...
It was more advanced, more protective.
If a husband abused his wife, she had the right to be compensated for those injuries.
I have to play the role of gatekeeper. We've run out of time for this segment. We'll continue our important discussion and deal with some common misconceptions of the Sharia when we return. So stay with us. welcome back. We're back with Mohammad Fadel and Dr. Faroque Khan learning all about the Sharia. Let's continue our discussion and deal with some people's possible misconceptions about this topic.
Right, we've been talking about Sharia countries, about Muslim countries that one way or another, more or less in some way or another, are run by the laws of the country are in some way in conformity with Sharia, or they attempt to make the laws of the country in conformity to Sharia law. But what about other countries like America, where Muslims are living in a non-Muslim country? What is the connection and what are some of the issues that have come up with Muslims trying to apply Sharia law in a country that is not a Muslim country?
Well, I think there's a difference. Well, one can't generalize about all non-Muslim countries. There's an important difference between a country such as ours that guarantees freedom of religion and freedom of exercise and a totalitarian communist country, for example, right?
So let's take America as an example.
Right. In the United States, there are lots of ways for religiously observant individuals, whether Muslims or Jewish or Catholic or anybody else of conscience, to incorporate their own rules of living into their own social relationships, especially take an example like family law. It's perfectly permissible under American law to enter into a marriage contract in which you agree, the parties agree, that they would arbitrate all their disputes according to, for example, Jewish law or Islamic law. That's permissible in the United States. So if Muslims wanted to have family law and subject their, regulate their own disputes, family law disputes, under the standards of Islamic law as opposed to the law of the state of New York, for example, the state of New York would allow them to do that. So religious freedom cures lots of the potential problems between church and state.
I think Rabbi's question is a very important one. Am I in conflict as a Muslim living in America with my religious guidelines and the secular constitution that we have? There are 5 basic principles. As long as my life is...
The 5 pillars of Islam?
No. Oh. As far as Sharia. As long as my life is safe, my religion is not attacked, my property rights are guaranteed, and my family lineage is not disturbed with, and I'm not driven crazy, I have no problem living as a freestanding U.S. citizen, practicing Muslim. So based on that, I see no conflict at all, living as a minority in the United States of America and following the U.S. Constitution. I do it, I vote,
Well, why do we sometimes get the impression that the Sharia is oppressive?
That's again a projection. I mean, if again, these honor killings we've been talking about a little earlier, it's against the tenets of the faith. Life is sacred. To kill somebody, I can't even practice euthanasia. I can't give a medication to ease somebody from severe pain if I have an intention of killing them.
So there's nothing in Sharia that if someone kills someone in your family, you pick out anybody in their family and kill them.
Tribal customs which have hung on for a long time.
But they're not Islam.
Absolutely not. Categorically, I can say that, no.
Now, what about...
How have your lives been influenced by Sharia?
Well, I think the most important way in which my life and other Muslims' lives are influenced by Sharia because we want to live a life that's pleasing to God. That's really the way that Muslims interact with Sharia. Is not in a political sense, but in the way that they get up in the morning and they get ready to pray. And then it's lunchtime and they get ready to pray. And it's afternoon time, they get ready to pray. And it's sunset time, they get ready to pray. And it's evening time, they get ready to pray. And then when it's Ramadan, they fast, right? And when they deal with people, they try to deal with them honestly and fairly. These are the ways that Sharia impacts the lives of individual Muslims in the most profound way.
So
right?
in the way, for example, a Catholic would go to church regularly or say the rosary, it's reminders of the path, the road that we should be on.
Yeah, Tom, Mohammed is talking from an individual perspective. Let me give you the manager's perspective. As the president of the Islamic Center, I run into always an issue of how should we decide the beginning of our month of Ramadan. Should we go by the traditional teaching that you have to see the crescent, or can we apply the scientific knowledge, which we have now?
We have exactly the same dispute in Judaism because we have a lunar calendar too.
So this conflict, this differences of opinion will continue. Some folks believe that we should stick with the original teaching and just sight the moon ourselves, while others believe that following the astronomical calendar is fine. And that's one of those issues of grappling the religious law and apply. And in my practice as a physician, end of life issue, beginning of life issues, surrogacy, stem cell, these are all involved around Sharia.
As Mark mentioned before, we're all, our three major religions, are all in a similar position in terms of the teaching about Tereshevo. And we need to help each other and learn from each other and share our scientific information with each other.
And that's what, as the youngest kid on the block here, as the Muslims, we're just emerging, and our groups are getting together and developing some coherent answers to these very complex issues.
Right. Also, Islam has come from a culture in which there's been no reformation, there's been no revolution within the Muslim world, in which religious identity and secular identity have been split, as they were in the development of American democratic traditions.
But Rabbi, we do have guidelines from the second Khalif after Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, died. When the second Khalif Umar came in power, he basically took some decisions which were very contrary to what was practiced and taught before. For example, he said, I will not allow zakat money to be given to recent converts.
Charity.
Charity, yeah, which was a teaching. And he said that from now on, slavery was very common, that he will prohibit the sale of slave women. So there are some precedents there that you can conform.
I'm the gatekeeper again. We've run out of time. Mark, your thoughts?
I just think that it's so impressive to see how this ancient tradition, one of three that we share is part of the Abrahamic faith, can evolve and develop. And I just think it's very exciting that Sharia is not a dead thing at all, but a living, growing, evolving understanding of how Muslims will live in the modern world.
And I also like the idea that there's a path, there's something to follow. There's something bigger than yourself that you're a part of. You're part of a community, and you're part of God. I'm Father Tom Hartman.
And I'm Rabbi Mark Gelman.
We're the God Squad. God bless you.
Hello, I'm Rabbi Mark Gelman. Welcome to our Muslim neighbors. Tommy's out chopping wood for the poor, and he'll be with us on other shows. And I just wanted to welcome all of you. For those of you who've been watching our Muslim neighbors, you know that most of our shows have a particular topic. We'll talk about the Hajj, or we'll talk about Sharia law, or we'll talk about the attitude toward women in Islam, some specific topic. But something's missing with that, and that is for you to share a conversation with our friends. We have some very close friends in the Muslim community who've advised us and helped us, and as we move forward in this world with all of the misunderstandings and hatreds that we want to reduce and that we want to eliminate, it really is friendship that will do it. It's not just good ideas, but good friends. So today we wanted to have a conversation with two of our dearest friends, the Imam Faisal Abdul Rauf a great Sufi scholar, a great Muslim, and a great friend. God bless you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
And an author of What's Right with Islam, one of the best introductions that you can read to the present state of Islam in our world. And congratulations for the success of the book.
Thank you very much.
It's good to have you with us.
Good to be
And of
with you.
course, the our backbone, our friend, our inspiration for this entire program, Dr. Faroque Khan from the Islamic Center of Long Island. Faroque, welcome.
Thank you.
So I'm just so glad you're here, because quite often in our shows with a single topic, things just fall through. And what we want to do is just have a show of conversation in which we talk about some of the pressing questions of the day and what your thoughts are. We sent our crew out to the streets to talk to some non-Muslim Americans about what questions they might have, what questions they might want to ask as they learn and read about Islam. So let's take a look at our people on the street, and let's try and answer some of their questions.
My question for our Muslim neighbors is, why can't women drive in Saudi Arabia?
Okay, the treatment of women and the status of women.
There are 56 countries in the world which have a Muslim majority population. There's only one country in the world where Muslim women are not allowed to drive, that is Saudi Arabia. So it clearly has nothing to do with the religion.
Right.
If it was religiously mandated, then
56 countries, right.
So it's basically a local, tribal, cultural phenomena, and I really don't have any explanation for it. It doesn't make sense to me.
The issues of custom has become very much the dominant factor in many Islamic countries. So
in other words, things that just are customs but not Islamic law.
Well, here's the Islamic law is not just Quranic law,
Right.
or the law of the Prophet. There's a lot more to Islam, to what's called the law, or Sharia law is whatever Muslims regarded as their law. And the custom and traditions in different areas, if it did not directly contradict a particular ordinance or a prohibition in the Quran or of the Prophet, it was deemed to be constitutional, if you will, or Sharia compliant. In that sense, it's Islamic. So while women in Saudi Arabia may not drive, for example, you have had 5 women heads of state of Islamic countries: Turkey, Pakistan, Bangladesh today, and Indonesia. Women are ministers. The vice president of Iran is a woman. You'll find ministers, you'll find professors, they drive, they are very much part of society.
All right, next question.
My question for our Muslim neighbors is, was Islam spread by the sword?
First of all, Islam was very rarely indeed spread by the sword. Right after the death of the Prophet, the Muslims did indeed have an empire. But
In the 8th century.
Even from the late 7th century, they began to expand and conquered Egypt and Palestine, Byzantium, and Iran. But many are unaware that until it took 5-6 centuries for Egypt to have a majority Muslim population. From the very beginning, in fact, the Arab Muslims did not enforce people and did not even encourage conversion towards Islam. It was only later that as people themselves opted to become Muslims. And until the end of the Ottoman Caliphate in 1924, Muslim rule has always engendered a multicultural, multi-faith tradition. And the Ottoman Caliphate until then, in Egypt until the mid-1900s, you had Greeks. You had, in fact, many areas of modern-day Turkey had majority Greek populations. You had Greeks, you had Armenians, you had Kurds, you had Arabs.
Right. The golden age of Judaism.
Exactly.
Is the 12th century in Spain under Muslim rule.
Where we had Jews, Muslims, and Christians thriving together, exchanging and learning from each other.
Mark, this question comes up all the time, and I want to use 2 examples. I was born and brought up in Kashmir, which is a predominantly Muslim community.
Sure.
And no one ever came there and brought it by sword. It was through the actions of the folks who had come from Muslim places, through the Sufis, that the whole community converted. Indonesia at this time is the largest Muslim country in the world. And no army has conquered it. It's through the experience of the traders that the mass conversions occurred. In United States, we have mass conversions going on right now. And there's no force. It's basically people get the message, they understand it, and they relate to it.
I'm surprised people don't ask, why was is it true that Judaism was spread by the sword? Because we had an empire. It was only 300 years, but we had an empire from 700 to 1,000 before, from 1,000 to 700 before the Common Era, and it was gone. So all of us have had an experience of empire, and all of us have had an experience of spreading religions through the word and not through the sword. Next question.
My question for our Muslim neighbors is, what is the Islamic view on euthanasia and suicide?
Okay, that's yours.
That's easy. No.
No. Same with Judaism.
Totally not permitted. Life is precious. You preserve life at all costs. However, now, many times I get this question about euthanasia from people who have a lot of pain and they want to be. Pain control is permitted.
Sure.
And as long as your intentions are to relieve the pain and not to perform euthanasia, it's okay. And intention is the key to all the actions. So the answer is very simple, it's not permitted.
And although in all of our traditions, correct me if I'm wrong, Doctor, we are allowed to remove an impediment to death.
Yes.
In other words, if your brain is dead and you're intubated or you're on a machine that's making you breathe through a machine, that you can remove that and let someone die.
Pulling the plug in a brain dead person is totally permissible.
Right, because they're already dead.
Yes.
Absolutely. So people should understand that. The quest for life, the protection of life, is virtually the same in every one of the Abrahamic faiths. It's one of our most precious shared possessions. So, our next question.
My question is, how are religious minorities treated in Muslim countries?
The traditional Islamic theological and legal or jurisprudential opinion is that minorities, religious minorities, have their rights and their rights have to be protected. What has happened, unfortunately, with the end of the Ottoman Caliphate and the paradigms that Muslim world has gone under over the last century has shifted from a multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious view of the good society to what I call the idea of religious nationalisms and authoritarianism. This has become very dominant in many countries of the Muslim world today, with the result that not only do minorities have had their rights denied, but even the Muslims themselves have had their human rights in many cases violated.
By other Muslims?
Yes, by their leaders, who may have been secular, like the
Baathists.
Like the Baathists, we can have fascism within an Islamic veneer, like what happened in Afghanistan under the Taliban.
But let's go to the actual question of minority, of the dhimmi. D-H-I-M-M-I?
Dhimmi, yes.
Dhimmi,
right.
which is the category of a non-Muslim resident.
Yes.
In a Muslim community. We have the category of ger v'toshav, which is a non-Jewish resident in a Jewish community. But what is so the law is that they must be protected. They cannot be disadvantaged. But can they be identified by certain special clothing or other limitations on their freedoms in accordance with?
This is not a requirement of the law. There was a custom in ancient times, until actually maybe a century ago, that people would always identify themselves by their religion, by their profession. If they were a particular profession, they would wear a particular kind of hat or a particular kind of robe. For example, in much of the Muslim world, religious scholars would wear a certain kind of hat with a wrapping around it. A farmer would wear a certain kind of clothing. Even in Europe, there was distinctions of identification, and part of the problem is that we're trying to judge or gauge ancient customs by the standards of modern custom, which is not really a fair thing. The big issue which people had always was security, personal security.
How would you assess the treatment of minorities at the moment in Muslim countries?
It leaves much to be desired. Of course, in some countries it's excellent, like in Malaysia, for example, and where they have figured out a way to share not only political power but also, more importantly, economic participation and well-being and prosperity.
Okay, well, we have to take a break. We'll be right back in a moment with more questions and answers with our friends on Our Muslim Neighbors. Stay with us. Welcome back. In our attempt to learn more about Islam, we wanted to be able to answer questions that are on the minds of the American people today. So let's go back out to our interviews on the street and see what the pressing questions are. Next question, please.
Hi, my question for our Muslim neighbors is, how come non-Muslims are not allowed in the holy cities of Mecca and Medina?
The strict legal theological prohibition is just in the area of Mecca and its surroundings.
At the Kaaba or the whole city?
Well, it's called the miqat, which is a general radius of maybe, 10, 20 miles from the Kaaba itself. There was no prohibition against any part of anywhere else. The prohibition against non-Muslims entering Medina only happened after the second Caliph Umar al-Khattab was assassinated by a non-Muslim in Medina.
Oh, so it was for a safety reason.
It was for a security reason.
And so that tradition sort of just continued.
And that tradition just became somehow duplicated in the area of Medina. However,
but what's the thinking in Mecca?
It's just a statement that unbelievers, in particular, the sanctity of the place is to adore God. And the purpose of Mecca was actually established by Abraham, according to our narratives,
yes.
by Abraham when he deposited his son Ishmael and his mother Hagar in that desolate spot.
Right.
So it was a space dedicated for the worship of God, and therefore the presence of non-Muslims with other kinds of activity would somehow mar the purity of this act of worship. It's purely from that kind of a rationale.
Very interesting. Next question.
Hi, my question for our Muslim neighbors is it true that anti-American rage is widespread throughout the Muslim world?
Okay, let's take that up. The anger against America from Muslim countries. How do you assess this?
Well, just an article in, I think, day before yesterday in the Washington Post indicated that there has been a growing anti-American sentiment across the whole world, not only in the Muslim world. It certainly exists in the Muslim world. And that has to do with the way our policies have been articulated to the rest of the world. If we articulate our positions well, it will make all the difference in the world. What we need to do is what our administration needs to point out is that the war on terror is not a war against Islam,
yes.
but it is a war for Islam, for the Islam of the Prophet, for the Islam of his companions, for the Islam of an enlightened Islam, a pluralistic Islam, not the Islam which many people have misunderstood and promulgated today.
I agree.
Rabbi, I just wanted to reinforce that the anger and the resentment felt throughout the world is about the policies. It's not about the American citizens.
Right.
This country is still held in great esteem. You go to any part of the world, you'll know about Coca-Cola, but you will not know about this kind of a conversation going on in a Catholic channel
with a rabbi
and two Muslims. The goodness of America is pretty much not known to the rest of the world.
The goodness of anything is not known through the news, and that's because, as we learned when we went on TV, if it bleeds, it leads.
And if it doesn't, it disappears.
So if there's a car wreck or a catastrophe or some terrible murder, that goes on. So you have to understand that people love what they love, and they're confused about certain things. And after all, it's obvious that many of the Arab leaders have used Israel as a scapegoat to have their people hate Israel rather than try and reform their own countries. And there are legitimate questions about American policy in addition to that. So it's a complicated question. When I look back at Jewish history, the Jewish-Muslim relations have been the most positive of all. And so really what we have to understand is that everyone who is a person of goodwill wants peace in this world. And the idea that there's irrational hatred to America is simply not true. I think that there are great changes that have occurred and great changes that are yet to be.
I think I wanted to pick up on something you made. One of the contributions we as a community in North America can make is help the folks in the Middle East move towards a just resolution of that ongoing conflict.
Absolutely.
Because that has a disproportionate impact throughout the world that unresolved Palestinian-Israeli issue.
Yes.
And if we can help those folks come to the table and get the issue settled, we'll all be better off.
I completely agree. May it happen speedily and in our time, and may it be God's will. Amen. Next question.
Hi, my question for our Muslim neighbors is, how does Islam view terrorism, and does the Quran condone it?
Let me take a shot at that.
Okay.
Suicide bombings come up all the time. A professor at the University of Chicago did a study for 21 years of suicide bombings and came to a conclusion that 40% of the 188 suicide bombings he studied occurred in a country which most people don't have a clue about, which is Sri Lanka, which is a dispute between the Buddhists and the Hindus.
That the Tamils?
The Tamils and the Sinhalese.
Right.
And the bottom line was that in an asymmetrical conflict where one side has all the weapons and the other side has nothing, this has been found to be a very effective tool to get back at the oppressors. And what he concluded was that it's pretty effective, it gets the message across, and we're going to see more and more of it, as we are seeing in Iraq now. And it is not religiously mandated. It is not approved by any faith to go out and blow up a bunch of people who haven't harmed you. So religiously it's not allowed. Killing innocent people is prohibited in all faiths.
Yes.
And Islam is pretty clear about it, that you cannot take an innocent life.
Do you believe that Muslim scholars in the world have made the case against Osama bin Laden clear enough? Have there been fatwas against terrorism and fatwas against prohibitions, religious prohibitions against Osama bin Laden from Muslim scholars?
Absolutely.
That have been widely publicized or publicized enough, in your opinion?
Well, as I pointed out in my book, right after 9/11, before the United States began to wage its hostilities against Afghanistan, the chaplain, the Muslim chaplain of the U.S. Armed Forces, sought a fatwa to answer the following question: is it okay for U.S. soldiers who are Muslims to engage in hostilities against fellow Muslims in Afghanistan? This question was referred to 5 of the most well-known jurists in the Muslim world, and they came up with a fatwa saying it is okay for Muslim soldiers in the U.S. Army to engage in hostilities. Now, I was called by Laurie Goodstein of the New York Times.
Yes, the religion reporter.
The religion reporter at the time, and I begged her to please give this article, front page article. At the time, they had a special section called the Nation Challenge section. You had stories about many other things. This would be very important.
Definitely.
This fatwa. It was buried on page B8.
Oh, God.
That's the challenge that we have. So it was advertised, it was made, but there was a decision not to amplify. This is where the media has an important role to play, which is why we're very happy doing this with you, Rabbi Gelman.
Well, and why we're happy to do it as well. This misunderstanding is actually fatal to our hopes.
Precisely. And this is why the civic responsibility of the media in amplifying those things, at least giving them a level playing field, if nothing else.
It's been a very informative session, but it's not over yet. We'll be right back with more when we return on Our Muslim Neighbors. Welcome back. Normally, we are put to the test by questions that children ask us on the God Squad. It's actually our favorite shows. Today, our guests are entertaining questions from people of all ages regarding the Muslim faith. Let's continue now with some more of our people on the street questions about Islam.
My question for our Muslim neighbors is, do you think the problem in Islam lies in the lack of a reformation like that in Christianity?
That particular question actually occurred in Islamic history. And if you examine Islamic history again until the end of the Ottoman Caliphate, until the early 20th century, there was a separation between what you might call mosque and state, effectively. The Sultan was viewed as the authoritative power, and you had the mufti, and you had the judiciary.
Yeah, you mean under the British Empire when the Muslims didn't have power, or where?
No, tradition throughout most of Islamic history, there has been a de facto separation between mosque and state, although not between religion and politics. I mean, for instance, in England, you don't have separation between church and state.
No, the Church of England is the religion of England.
And the Queen appoints the Archbishop of Canterbury. Yes. And issues of doctrine have to be approved by the British Parliament. But Britain developed a separation between religion and politics. Whereas in countries like India, for example, where you have a separation of, let's say, temple and state, politics is very much imbued with issues of religion. Right. So this distinction is an important one.
Even though there may have been a separation between the caliph, the secular ruler, and the various religious authorities, they were separated and they were both Muslims. The question that I think is behind this question is Islam prepared theologically, emotionally, to live in a separation in which the caliph is not the caliph, but the president of the United States?
I think the answer there is that, when you're living as a minority, you follow the law of the land.
Right.
That's a guideline which has been laid down very clearly. So I have no conflict living in America as an American Muslim under the rules and regulations of the U.S. Constitution, as long as it doesn't violate my religion, my life, and guarantees my protection.
But the basic thing that people need to hear then and understand is there's no conflict within Islam of living in a country that is ruled by a non-Muslim leader.
The American Muslims have no conflict in living in America as Americans, practicing their faith, abiding by the laws and rules of this United States.
Absolutely.
And neither do we seek to establish an Islamic state in America, if that's what some people are.
Yes, feel. It is what some people are saying, and it's foolish.
Well, that's exactly what happened to the Catholic Church in this country. The bishops in the first half of the 20th century the Council of Bishops had to actually express that the Catholic Church, the Catholics in America, have no desire to establish a unification of Catholic Church and state in America, which was a fear at that time.
Absolutely. Look, John Kennedy had to address that directly in 1960. Exactly. As late as 1960, it was an issue, and people forget that there were state religions in America into the 19th century. A state would have its own state religion. Yes. So this separation that we think has always existed in America hasn't, and the unity between Islam and the state that we think always exists hasn't. Right. So we need to have a more balanced view about all this. I think really that's the main idea. I want to close with what are your main hopes for the future?
My main hope for the future is to see an Islam that is vibrant, that is loving to its fellow faith traditions. I love to see a Muslim community in America that succeeds in mediating between America and harmonizing the relationship between America and the Muslim world. I'd like to see an American Muslim community that helps develop the democratic systems and regimes and separations of power and economic well-being that most people in the Muslim world long for. And I look for a greater spirituality and the revitalization of our fundamental Abrahamic ethic, to love the Lord our God with all of our heart, our minds, our soul, and strength, and to love our fellow human being, which means people like Dr. Faroque Khan here, and people like you, Rabbi Mark Gelman, and Monsignor Tom Hartman, as we love ourselves.
Inshallah. May it be God's will. Farouk?
I can't possibly improve on that.
No, none of us can.
But my hope is that we develop an American Muslim identity, which will be a model for the rest of the community across the globe, as a place where we can work together, as we have done in the past, like in Spain, and basically help in the betterment of our common citizens throughout the world.
Inshallah. And what I hope is that we have enough courage and love to look as we climb the same mountain to the other paths, at the other climbers who are making this world better, more gentle, and more open to God's will. I'm Rabbi Mark Gelman of the God Squad. God bless you.